What is FPS? FPS is simply frames per second. And we have 24, 30, 60 and 120 frames per second. You might ask me, don't all these stops do the same thing? No, they do not do the same thing. Each and every stop has why and when it's used based on the situation or based on what you are trying to capture. So if you are someone who films content, you need to know this. So let's start with 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second simply means in each second, 24 frames is being captured by your camera lens or your camera sensor. So this stop is normally the industry standard for Hollywood movie production. And why do they film or why do they prefer to shoot their content in 24 frames per second? This is simply because when you are capturing your scene using a lower FPS, it more or less leaves a blur trail when there is movement. So let's say you are filming me and I decide to move my hand. When I'm filming in 24 frames per second, it leaves a trail of blur behind. And these subtle blurs that is being left behind when shooting in 24 frames per second gives the output more or less a cinematic feel to it, a dreamy-like output. And this is more pleasant for movie production. So when you want to shoot anything cinematic, 24 frames per second is your go-to FPS to shoot. The next one is 30 FPS. And 30 FPS is more or less the everyday standard for recording content. So when you buy a mobile phone for the first time, by default, your FPS is set to 30 because 30 FPS represents what our eyes see. So every movement that is being created that our eye sees, 30 FPS tries to mimic that. So when you want to capture anything quick, anything just every day, you want to capture a talking head shot, you want to capture a short vlog, you want to capture anything just quick, 30 FPS is the standard to go because, as I said, it mimics what our eyes actually see. Moving on to 60 frames per second. Recording in 60 frames per second is when your shot or your video becomes very smooth. It gets smoother than the 30 and way smoother than the 24 frames per second. So when do we use this? We use 60 frames per second when we want to capture quick actions, movement, or anything fast. So let's say you're watching a football match in your neighborhood and you want to capture that. Because of the movements in the football game or in the sports game, you need to shoot in 60 frames per second in order to capture double the frames being coming in. So if you are to record in 30 frames per second, if an athlete pass, he will leave a long trail of blur because your camera sensor couldn't capture him right in time when he was moving. But 60 frames per second give you the time to be able to catch him whilst he moves. So you get still footage and smooth footage. Last but not the least, 120 FPS. So with 120 FPS, you kind of entering slow motion territory. Let me explain. I say slow motion territory because 120 frames per second also doubles or captures double the amount of frames being captured per second as compared to 60. So let's say you are watching a Formula 1 race. You see how fast the car moves. Your preferably FPS stop you need to record in is 120 to be able to freeze the movement and get clearer shots. And in doing so, because you have more frames per second in your shot, when you decide to slow the footage down, no matter how much you slow it down, you don't lose detail, but you rather retain more detail when you slow it down as compared to recording in a standard 30 frames per second and deciding to slow it down. When you record in 30 or any lower frames per second and you decide to slow it down, because there are no more frames for your editor or for the footage to work with, it then decides to now crop out, crop in, crop out things, and that leads to grainy footage or low quality slow motion shots. But rather, when you shoot in 120 frames per second or even 60 frames per second, when you turn or you decide to slow your footage down, because there's so many frames to work with, you don't lose details but rather retain them in the reduced or slow motion video output. So what's the mistake people usually make? They normally record everything on the same frame rate and they then sit down and wonder why some of the clips looks off as compared to others. You just need to match your frame per second to what you're actually shooting. So now that you know go and adjust your settings before your next video shoot. I'm Nia Teteria. This is Night Trend Digitals. Catch you the next one. Peace out.